It begins with a sound that no president should ever have to hear. It's not the roar of a crowd, the applause of Congress, or the thunder of a jet engine. It is the sickening, muffled groan of wood under pressure, the crack of plaster giving way, and the terrifying vibration of a chandelier swaying in a room where the air is still. It is the sound of history collapsing under its own weight. Picture Washington, D.C. in the late 1940s. The war is over, the soldiers are home, and America is stepping into its role as the superpower of the world. But at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the physical heart of the nation is dying. The White House, the symbol of American democracy, is literally falling apart. Inside the grand halls where Lincoln grieved and Roosevelt led a nation through the Depression, the floors are tilting. The walls are separating from the ceilings. And in one of the most famous incidents, the leg of a grand piano in the East Room doesn't just touch the floor, it punches straight through the rotting wood, crashing into the basement below. This wasn't just a maintenance issue, it was a structural emergency. The most famous house in America had become a death trap. Today, on the master plan, we are going back to 1948 to uncover the most ambitious architectural surgery in history. We are going to see how the United States government faced an impossible choice: destroy the icon or save it, and how they decided to gut the entire building, stripping it down to a hollow shell, and rebuilding a steel skyscraper inside the historic bricks, all without the American public ever realizing the president's house was essentially gone. To understand the crisis of 1948, we have to look back at how the White House was built. It wasn't constructed as a modern fortress. It was built as a Georgian mansion using the technology of 1800. We are talking about heavy load-bearing masonry walls, timber floors, and simple stone foundations. Remember, Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp. The ground is soft, filled with clay and silt. When George Washington laid the cornerstone, the builders didn't drive piles deep into bedrock. They simply dug down a few feet and started laying walls on top of compacted soil and sand. For the first century, the house managed to hold on, even after the British burned it in 1814. But by the turn of the 20th century, the renovations started to destroy the house. This is the classic engineering nightmare. You have a structure designed for a certain load, and you keep adding weight to it. Theodore Roosevelt added the massive West Wing, taking the work out of the residents. William Howard Taft added the famous Oval Office. Then came the heavy iron plumbing, the coal-fired furnaces, the boilers, and miles of electrical wiring hidden behind the plaster. By the time Harry S. Truman moved in during 1945, the house was groaning. Truman was known to be a bit of a history buff, and he took an interest in the building's creaks. He noted that in the family quarters on the second floor, the floors felt spongy, like walking on a trampoline. He could see cracks running up the wallpaper in the private study. The situation became critical when the Commission on the Renovation of the Executive Mansion was finally allowed to drill core samples into the structure. What they found terrified everyone. The wooden beams, some of them original 150-year-old pine, were so waterlogged and rotten they could be crumbled by hand. The building was being held together by paint and plaster. One engineer famously noted that if the wind blew hard enough from a certain direction, or if there was a slight tremor, the entire second floor could collapse into the first floor, crushing the president and his family. President Truman was faced with a brutal, gut-wrenching decision. The commission gave him two options. Option A was the most logical engineering solution: total demolition. Tear the White House down, brick by brick, and build a brand new replica. It would be safer, stronger, cheaper, and would take less time. But the political and emotional cost was astronomical. Could the United States of America really bulldoze the house where Lincoln lived during the Civil War? Could you destroy the walls that Jefferson walked past? To the American public, the White House wasn't just a building. It was the physical manifestation of the nation's soul. Destroying it was unthinkable. Option B was the gamble of the century. Keep the exterior walls standing, the famous face of the White House, and tear out absolutely everything else. They would have to remove the floors, the roof, the interior walls, the foundations, and the debris. They would essentially turn the house into a hollow shell. Truman chose option B. In his own words, he said, "The White House belongs to the American people. We cannot destroy it." And so, in 1949, the Truman family packed their bags and moved across the street to Blair House, which would serve as the temporary White House for the next 4 years. It was time to start the surgery. Now, let's talk about the engineering master plan. How do you take a building that is falling down and tear out its insides without the exterior walls collapsing into the street? The structure was a box. The 4 exterior walls held up the roof. If you remove the roof, the walls would splay outward. If you remove the floors, the walls would buckle inward. The architects and engineers, led by Douglas Orr and William Delano, came up with a brilliant, temporary solution, the Spiderweb. Before they could gut a single room, they installed 350 tons of temporary steel shoring. They erected a massive steel framework inside the house that clamped onto the exterior walls. This temporary skeleton pushed outward against the bricks, holding them in place while the internal support was removed. It looked like a giant cage had been dropped over the mansion. Once the house was clamped together, the demolition crews moved in. This wasn't careful preservation. It was aggressive extraction. They ripped out the grand staircases. They tore up the herringbone floors. They smashed the plaster ceilings. Historical moldings were numbered and cataloged, but the wood beams underneath were chopped into pieces. By late 1950, if you walked into the White House, you wouldn't see a room. You would see a vast, empty cavern. You could stand in the center of the house, look up at the sky, and see the roof supported only by steel beams, with the historic white columns standing like toothpicks against the sky. The White House was hollow. With the house gutted, they could finally fix the root of the problem, the ground. The original foundations were made of piled stone sitting in soft mud. The new plan called for a modern engineering solution: reinforced concrete piles. Excavators dug deep pits down to the bedrock, which in some areas was 25 feet below ground. They drove concrete piles into the earth. On top of these piles, they poured massive concrete footings that formed a solid, immovable platform for the new house. This ensures that if a 7.0 earthquake hit Washington tomorrow, the White House would barely shake. But the engineers didn't stop there. Since the house was already gutted down to the dirt, they realized they had a unique opportunity: space. They decided to go down. They excavated a massive area under the north portico, digging 2 entirely new levels of basement. These sub-basements would become the mechanical heart of the building and, more importantly, a secret defensive fortress. This is the core of the master plan. Inside the hollowed-out brick shell, the crew erected a massive steel frame. Imagine putting a skyscraper skeleton inside a dollhouse. They built a structural steel frame that was 3 stories high inside the residence. This steel frame carries 100% of the load of the house now. The brick walls are no longer holding up the floors and roof. In fact, the brick walls are now tied to the steel frame using giant brackets called corbels. The steel frame is doing the work, and the historic walls are just hanging on it like a curtain. This construction technique allowed them to modernize everything. They installed air conditioning for the first time in the White House's history. They installed new elevators that were stronger and faster. They built fireproof walls between the living quarters and the offices. They installed a massive air filtration system capable of protecting against a chemical or biological attack. They essentially turned a fragile museum into a modern battleship. Let's take a moment to appreciate the context of the 1950s. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had just tested the atomic bomb. The Korean War was breaking out. The United States government was paranoid about the possibility of a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C. The renovation of the White House wasn't just about fixing the floors. It was about survival. In those new sub-basements, they built the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, or the PEOC. This is a bunker designed to withstand a nuclear blast. It is hardened against radiation, shockwaves, and biological threats. If the worst were to happen, the president, the cabinet, and key staff would descend into this underground fortress. This is the same bunker that Vice President Dick Cheney retreated to on September 11, 2001, when the nation was under attack. The Master Plan of 1948 ensured that the command center of the United States could survive the apocalypse. While the steel was going up, a different kind of team was working on the interior. This was the delicate part. They wanted the White House to look exactly as it did in the 1800s. They had cataloged 60 rooms of furniture, mantels, doors, and hardware. Workers carefully cleaned, refinished, and reinstalled these pieces. However, not everything could be saved. Some of the original timber was too far gone. In a brilliant public relations move, the government sold the old, damaged bricks and lumber to the American public. For a small donation, you could buy a piece of the White House. Thousands of Americans, including my grandfather, still have a souvenir brick from 1949 sitting on their mantels. It was a way for the nation to pay for the renovation and take a piece of history home with them. One major addition to the interior was the grand staircase. The original stairs were narrow and steep. Truman wanted a grander entrance for state guests. They built a new staircase that you see today when you walk through the Cross Hall. It is wider, more elegant, and made of the finest American marble. It's a perfect example of how the renovation improved the function while keeping the style. There is one highly visible change to the exterior of the White House that came out of this renovation, and it caused a massive controversy. If you look at the south portico of the White House today, you will see the Truman balcony on the second floor. It's a curved white balcony with iron railings. When Truman proposed adding this balcony, traditionalists went crazy. They said it ruined the classical architecture of the house. They said it made it look like a hotel. But Truman had a practical reason. He was a man of the people, and he loved the outdoors. He noticed that there was no place on the second floor where the first family could step outside for fresh air without walking all the way down to the lawn and being surrounded by guards and tourists. He wanted a private spot to get some sun. The architects designed the balcony to be structurally supported by the new steel frame, so it didn't harm the building. Today, it is one of the most iconic features of the house, proving that Truman was right. In March of 1952, after 4 years of construction, the project was finished. The total cost was $5.4 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $60 million today, a bargain for a project of this magnitude. President Truman and First Lady Bess Truman moved back in. The press was invited in to see the transformation. To the naked eye, the White House looked exactly the same. The pillars were the same. The windows were the same. The paint was the same. But underneath the skin, it was a completely different beast. It was a fortress of steel and concrete. It was fireproof, earthquake-proof, and nuclear-proof. It had central air, modern electricity, and hidden basements filled with technology. The White House that stands today on Pennsylvania Avenue is not the house that George Washington lived in. It is a steel skyscraper wearing the mast of a colonial mansion. It is the ultimate architectural disguise. This renovation saved the White House. Without the guts of 1948, the building likely would have been condemned by the 1960s. It would have been too dangerous to live in and too expensive to fix. The Truman Reconstruction is a master plan in every sense of the word. It required the political courage to take a risk, the engineering genius to solve an impossible puzzle, and the respect for history to preserve the past while building for the future. It reminds us that strength isn't just about what is on the outside. It's about the unseen structure underneath. The United States of America is the same way. It is built on a foundation of laws and ideas, reinforced by generations of people who constantly repair, renovate, and improve it. We look at the facade and see history, but we rely on the skeleton to keep us safe. Thank you for watching this episode of The Master Plan. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American engineering, please hit that like button and subscribe. We have a whole month of videos coming up where we decode the secrets behind the Statue of Liberty, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Pentagon. Let me know in the comments, do you think the White House needs another renovation soon? Or is it good to go for another 100 years? I'll see you in the next blueprint.